He was the third most powerful man in the Third Reich, Hitler's own deputy. But on a spring night in 1941, he stole a secret plane, flew it alone into enemy airspace, and parachuted into a field in Scotland. The official story? He was insane. But what if his mission was real? What if he carried a peace offer that could have changed the entire war? And what if the Allies locked him away for 46 years, not for his crimes, but to bury a secret so dangerous it could have shattered the alliance against Hitler? The 10th of May, 1941. The sky over the sleeping hills of Scotland was a vast, cold canvas of moonlit clouds, the air still and heavy with the scent of damp earth and peat. This was a land that measured time in seasons and centuries, a place of ancient stone and quiet endurance, seemingly a world away from the mechanized fury that was tearing Europe apart. For David McLean, a farmer tending to his fields near the village of Eaglesham, the war was a distant rumble, a voice on the wireless, the occasional drone of a friendly Spitfire overhead. Then, shortly after 11 o'clock, the night was torn by a new sound. It was not the familiar, purposeful thrum of a British patrol, nor the deep, terrifying groan of a German bombing raid on its way to Glasgow. This was a solitary engine, a ragged, sputtering cough high in the darkness. It was the sound of a wounded beast, a machine in its death throes, growing louder and more desperate as it lost its battle with gravity. McLean looked up from his cottage, his eyes scanning the clouds. He saw it then, a dark, twin-engined shape, a silhouette he did not recognize, spiraling downwards. A moment later, a small white flower blossomed against the dark sky, a parachute, a ghost detaching itself from its dying metal bird. The plane continued its plunge, its engine finally screaming into a terminal dive before it met the Scottish soil with a violent, percussive crash, a brief, angry blossom of orange flame that was quickly swallowed by the darkness. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Armed with a pitchfork, more out of habit than any sense of real defense, David McLean made his way across the field toward the spot where the parachutist might have landed. In a furrowed field, he found him. A man in the gray-blue uniform of a Luftwaffe captain was struggling to free himself from his parachute harness, his ankle clearly injured. McLean, his rural Scottish accent thick, approached the strange visitor. The German pilot, surprisingly, responded in halting but clear English. He was polite, almost aristocratic, despite the pain. He asked for his host's name, and then made a request of breathtaking strangeness. He insisted on being taken to the Duke of Hamilton, claiming he had an urgent and vital message for him. McLean, bewildered, helped the injured airman back to his cottage, offering him a cup of tea while members of the local home guard were summoned. The downed pilot was an oddity, a curiosity, a living, breathing piece of the distant war that had just fallen into their laps. They treated him with a mixture of suspicion and hospitality. He was, after all, the enemy, but he was also a man with a broken ankle, far from home. It was only when an officer from the Royal Observer Corps arrived to formally interrogate the prisoner that the true earth-shattering nature of the night's event began to reveal itself. The officer asked the pilot for his name and rank. The man, sitting in a simple farmhouse chair, his face pale in the lantern light, looked up. His voice was calm, devoid of panic, imbued with a sense of profound, almost delusional self-importance. "My name is Rudolf Hess." The room fell silent. It was a name everyone knew. The Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, the right hand of Adolf Hitler, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. And he was here, in a Scottish farmhouse, nursing a broken ankle and asking for a cup of tea. The war had not just come to David McLean's farm. The war itself had suddenly lost its mind, and a mystery that would endure for decades had just begun. To comprehend the sheer madness of the flight, one must first understand the man who made it. Rudolf Hess was not some peripheral figure in the Nazi hierarchy, not a disgruntled general or a minor bureaucrat. He was, for nearly 2 decades, the beating heart of the movement's fanaticism, the high priest of the cult of Hitler. If Hitler was the voice of National Socialism, Hess was its echo, a man whose entire identity, purpose, and power were derived from his absolute, unquestioning proximity to the Führer. He was not just a follower, he was the original disciple, the shadow that gave the leader substance. Born in Alexandria, Egypt, to a wealthy German merchant family, Hess was a quiet, brooding, and deeply introverted young man. The First World War gave his life the purpose it craved. He served as an infantryman and later as a pilot, earning the Iron Cross. But he ended the war filled with a profound sense of national humiliation and a burning desire for Germany's resurrection. It was in the chaotic, seething political cauldron of post-war Munich that he found his Messiah. The first time Hess heard Adolf Hitler speak at a beer hall rally, it was a moment of religious conversion. In Hitler's raw, hypnotic rage, Hess found the articulation of all his own formless anxieties and hopes. He saw not a politician, but a savior. From that moment on, his devotion was total and terrifyingly pure. He became one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party, member number 16. Their bond was forged in the crucible of the failed 1923 beer hall putsch. Marching alongside Hitler, Hess was arrested and imprisoned with him in Landsberg prison. This was no mere incarceration, it was a sacred incubation. In the relative comfort of their confinement, Hess became Hitler's personal secretary, his confidant, his sounding board. It was Hess who took dictation, typing out the rambling, venomous manuscript that would become Mein Kampf. His hands were the first to give physical form to the blueprint for a decade of slaughter. He did not just transcribe the words, he absorbed them, becoming a living vessel for the Führer's ideology. When Hitler finally seized power in 1933, Hess was at his side, rewarded for his unwavering loyalty with a position of immense, if vaguely defined, power. He was appointed Deputy Führer of the Nazi Party. He was the gatekeeper, the man who controlled access to Hitler, the enforcer of party doctrine. He signed his name to the infamous Nuremberg laws, stripping Jews of their citizenship and paving the way for the Holocaust. Every decree, every appointment, every new wave of terror within the party flowed through his office. He was the ultimate insider, the man who stood, quite literally, just behind Hitler's right shoulder at the great Nuremberg rallies, his face a mask of rapt devotion. But his power was a reflection, not a source. He was the moon to Hitler's sun. He had no real army, no independent political base. His authority was entirely dependent on his personal relationship with the Führer. And as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, that relationship began to change. The war shifted the gravity of power in the Reich. Men like Hermann Göring, with his Luftwaffe, Heinrich Himmler, with his SS, and Martin Bormann, the master of bureaucratic intrigue, began to eclipse him. They were men of action, of armies and industries and empires of terror. Hess, the keeper of the party's ideological flame, was becoming increasingly marginalized, a relic of the early struggle in a new era of total war. He still held his titles, he still appeared at Hitler's side, but the shadow was lengthening. He was losing his proximity to the sun. And for a man whose entire existence was defined by that light, the encroaching darkness was an existential threat, a terror that could drive a man to an act of sublime, world-altering desperation. The flight of Rudolf Hess did not happen in a vacuum. It was a bolt of lightning that tore through the sky at the most electrically charged and dangerously unstable moment of the Second World War. To understand the flight, one must understand the world of May 1941, a world holding its breath, a world balanced on the razor's edge between a swift German victory and a long, drawn-out global slaughter. From Berlin, the world looked almost conquered. The black and red banner of the swastika flew from the North Cape of Norway to the sun-drenched shores of Greece. France, the great rival, had been humiliated and dismembered in a matter of weeks. The Low Countries had been overrun. The Balkans were subjugated. German U-boats, the gray wolves of the Atlantic, were strangling the island nation of Britain, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of vital shipping each month. The Wehrmacht, the seemingly invincible German army, stood as the undisputed master of the European continent. It was the high watermark of the Third Reich, a moment of supreme, intoxicating power. But this power was deceptive, and Adolf Hitler knew it. The victory was incomplete. Across the gray, churning waters of the English Channel, one enemy remained, defiant and unbroken. Great Britain, under the bulldog leadership of Winston Churchill, refused to yield. The Royal Air Force had narrowly won the Battle of Britain, denying Germany control of the skies and making a cross-channel invasion impossible for the time being. Now, Britain was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fortress of defiance, a base from which the war could be continued and, one day, brought back to the continent. Churchill's policy was one of absolute, implacable resistance. He would make no peace with the monster of wickedness in Berlin. This British defiance was a festering wound in Hitler's strategic flank, but it was not his primary concern. His gaze, and the gaze of his entire military machine, was turning eastward. In the spring of 1941, the greatest concentration of military force in human history was secretly gathering along the border of the Soviet Union. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft were being moved into position for Operation Barbarossa, the surprise invasion that Hitler believed would be his true, crowning achievement. In his mind, the war against Britain was a tragic, unnatural conflict between two Germanic peoples. The real war, the apocalyptic, ideological crusade, was against the Judeo-Bolshevism of the Soviet Union. He was convinced that once the USSR was shattered in a single swift campaign, a matter of a few months, he believed, Britain would see the futility of its position and sue for peace. The entire fate of the world rested on this gamble. If Germany could crush the Soviet Union quickly, it would control a vast, resource-rich empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, a fortress that could potentially hold out forever. But if the invasion bogged down, if Russia did not collapse, Germany would be trapped in the one scenario that haunted its generals since the days of the Kaiser, a dreaded, draining, and ultimately unwinnable war on two fronts. This was the world on a knife's edge. In Britain, a nation bled white but unbowed, fighting on with grim determination. In Germany, a regime at the zenith of its power, secretly preparing for its biggest, most fateful gamble. And in the middle, a small but influential circle of British aristocrats and German Anglophiles who still clung to the hope of a negotiated peace, a peace that would save Britain's empire and give Germany a free hand to pursue its destiny in the East. It was into this impossibly tense and volatile moment, just 6 weeks before the first Panzer tanks would roll across the Soviet border, that Rudolf Hess, the Führer's shadow, decided to take history into his own hands and fly his lonely, desperate mission into the heart of the storm. The journey of Rudolf Hess began not as a single, impulsive act, but as a meticulous and deeply personal obsession, a secret project nurtured over months in the silent corridors of his mind. While the world saw the Deputy Führer performing his ceremonial duties, the man himself was consumed by a singular, audacious plan, preparing for the most important flight of his life with the obsessive precision of a monk preparing for a sacred ritual. He was, after all, a pilot. The sky was his first love, a place of clean lines, clear rules, and heroic solitude that stood in stark contrast to the messy, treacherous intrigue of the Nazi court. He chose his steed with care, a Messerschmitt Bf 110, a twin-engine heavy fighter, a destroyer known for its long range and stability. He requisitioned it from the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg under the pretext of practicing long-distance navigation. He became a familiar, if eccentric, figure at the airfield, a high-ranking minister who seemed unusually interested in the minutiae of fuel consumption and radio frequencies. His chief adjutant, Karl-Heinz Pinch, was sworn to secrecy, assisting with the preparations, believing he was party to a secret mission sanctioned by the Führer himself. Hess had the aircraft subtly modified. Extra fuel tanks were fitted into the fuselage, replacing the space for the radio operator and gunner. This would be a solo flight. The plane's oxygen system was enhanced for the high-altitude journey. He pored over maps of the North Sea, charting a precise, dog-legged course designed to avoid the main British radar and fighter patrol corridors. He studied weather patterns and moon phases, waiting for the perfect convergence of conditions. He even consulted his astrologers, seeking a celestial blessing for his terrestrial mission. On the morning of Saturday, May 10, 1941, the omens were right. He spent the day with his wife Ilse and their young son, a picture of calm domesticity that belied the storm raging within him. He gave no hint of his intentions, a final, chilling act of deception. As dusk began to fall, he put on his Luftwaffe captain's uniform, a rank far below his actual station, a costume for the role he was about to play. He gathered his papers, a portfolio containing his peace proposal, photographs of his son, and a collection of homeopathic remedies for the journey. He then sat down and wrote a long, rambling letter to Adolf Hitler, a letter that would be delivered only after his departure. It was a testament to his tortured state of mind, a mixture of fanatical devotion and breathtaking arrogance. He explained that he was undertaking a final, desperate mission to secure the peace with Britain that he knew the Führer secretly desired, a peace that would allow Germany to fulfill its destiny in the East without the distraction of a war in the West. He was offering himself as a sacrifice, a man willing to risk his life and reputation for the good of the Reich. He ended the letter by telling Hitler that if his mission failed, the Führer could simply disavow him and declare him insane. At 5:45 p.m., as the sun began its descent, Hess's Bf 110 roared to life on the runway at Augsburg. He waved to Pinch, a final, lonely salute, and then pushed the throttles forward. The Eagle had taken flight. He flew north, a solitary silver shark moving through the twilight over his own country. As he crossed the coastline into the vast emptiness of the North Sea, he was utterly alone, a single speck of metal and conviction suspended between a darkening sea and a sky full of stars. The journey was a masterpiece of navigation, a testament to his skill as a pilot. He flew for hours, a disembodied voice in the ether, a ghost on the edge of Britain's defenses. As he approached the Scottish coast, the moment of truth arrived. He was detected. But his low altitude and strange course confused the defenders. He was a single, anomalous blip. He pushed his engines to their limit, racing inland. His destination was Dungavel House, the estate of the Duke of Hamilton, the man he believed was the key to peace. But now, his fuel was gone. The extra tanks were dry. The engines began to sputter and die. His mission could not end in a controlled landing. He had to abandon his steed. At over 10,000 feet, in the freezing darkness over a foreign land, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, slid back his cockpit canopy, stood up, and leaped into the void. The landing of Rudolf Hess was a stone dropped into the dark pool of the Second World War, and the ripples spread outwards with lightning speed, creating two distinct, simultaneous, and equally powerful shockwaves that struck the corridors of power in London and Berlin. In both capitals, the news was greeted with the same initial emotion: sheer, unadulterated disbelief. In Britain, the shock was one of profound and dizzying confusion. The initial report that the Deputy Führer was in custody in a Glasgow barracks was so bizarre that the first officials to hear it dismissed it as a prank or a case of mistaken identity. But as the confirmation came through, the absurdity gave way to a wave of frantic speculation. The news traveled up the chain of command. A hot coal passed from hand to hand until it reached the Prime Minister himself. Winston Churchill was at Ditchley Park, a country estate used as a secure weekend retreat, watching a Marx Brothers movie when his private secretary interrupted with the news. Churchill, who had spent the last year steeling his nation for a war of survival against a monolithic and seemingly infallible enemy, was utterly floored. He could not, for a moment, comprehend it. Was it a trap? A cunningly orchestrated plot to sow dissent? Was Hess a Trojan horse, the forerunner of an invasion? Or was it a genuine sign that the Nazi regime, so outwardly strong, was beginning to crack from within? The entire British war cabinet was thrown into a state of bewildered paralysis. The prisoner's strange insistence on seeing the Duke of Hamilton only deepened the mystery. The Duke, a serving RAF wing commander, was summoned and was as baffled as everyone else. He had met Hess briefly at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but had no other connection to him. In London, the news was a puzzle box dropped from the sky, a riddle with no obvious answer, but one that contained either a cobra or a key. In Germany, the shock was of a different nature entirely. It was the shock of intimate personal betrayal and catastrophic public humiliation. The news arrived at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine sanctuary, carried by Hess's nervous adjutant, Karl-Heinz Pinch, who delivered the Deputy Führer's sealed letter. Hitler was surrounded by his inner circle, the paladins of the Reich. He took the letter and began to read. Witnesses described a terrifying transformation. Hitler's face, at first confused, contorted into a mask of silent, murderous fury. For a long moment, he was utterly still, absorbing the magnitude of his deputy's desertion. Then came the explosion. Hitler let out a primal roar of rage that echoed through the mountain chalet, a sound of pure, wounded fury. He paced the room like a caged tiger, screaming that Hess had betrayed him, had made him a fool in the eyes of the world. He turned on the assembled Nazi leaders, Göring, Ribbentrop, Goebbels, accusing them of incompetence, their faces pale with fear. The carefully constructed myth of the Nazi leadership as a band of loyal, unified brothers had been shattered by the one man Hitler had trusted most completely. But rage quickly gave way to the cold, reptilian logic of political survival. Hitler understood instantly that he had to control the narrative. The truth, that his deputy had flown to the enemy to offer a rogue peace deal, was unthinkable. It would signal weakness, division, and chaos. There was only one possible explanation that could save face. "He is insane," Hitler declared. The decision was made in that moment. The propaganda machine was ordered into high gear. Goebbels was to announce to the world that Rudolf Hess, a man long known for his eccentricities, had suffered a mental breakdown, that he was a deluded idealist living in a world of hallucination. It was a lie born of pure, panicked necessity. Orders were issued for the immediate arrest of Hess's entire staff. A curtain of silence and denial was to be dropped over the affair. And so, as London grappled with a surreal mystery, Berlin was consumed by a furious, frantic cover-up. Two capitals, two enemy governments, united for a brief moment in a state of total, dumbfounded shock, their plans and certainties thrown into chaos by the lonely flight of a single, enigmatic man. In the days following his bizarre arrival, Rudolf Hess was moved to a series of secure locations, including, for a time, the Tower of London, becoming its most high-profile prisoner in centuries. He was no longer a mysterious figure who had fallen from the sky. He was Prisoner Z, the most valuable and perplexing captive of the war. A team of high-level interrogators, including diplomats and intelligence experts, was assembled to unlock the secrets held within his strange, troubled mind. What they found was not a simple traitor or a madman, but a man delivering a message from a parallel political universe, a peace proposal of breathtaking arrogance and naivety. His initial interviews were with the Duke of Hamilton, the man he had flown halfway across Europe to see. The Duke, a loyal servant of the Crown, listened with polite bewilderment as Hess, speaking with the earnest conviction of a true believer, laid out his mission. He insisted he had come on a mission of humanity, that the Führer, Adolf Hitler, wanted no more war with the British people. He explained that Germany's true enemy was Bolshevism, and that the continued conflict between the two Nordic races was a tragic, fratricidal crime. As the formal interrogations began, the full scope of his proposal became clear. It was less a negotiation and more a declaration of terms, a victor's peace offered from a prison cell. The core of Hess's plan was a simple, brutal division of the world. 1. A free hand for Germany in Europe. Britain was to recognize Germany's complete and total domination of the European continent. Germany would be the undisputed master of Europe, its conquests legitimized, its sphere of influence absolute. 2. The British Empire remains intact. In exchange for this, Germany would offer a full guarantee of the British Empire. Britain could keep its global possessions, India, Africa, the Far East, and Germany would not interfere. Hess presented this as a generous concession, a gift from one great empire to another. 3. Return of German colonies. As a matter of honor, Britain would have to return the former German colonies that had been seized after World War I. 4. Peace and a joint war against the USSR. Once this agreement was reached, the war in the West would end. Hess hinted, though perhaps not explicitly, that the two great powers could then turn their attention to their common enemy, the Soviet Union. To the British interrogators, this was a fantasy. It was a proposal that completely ignored the moral and political realities of the war. Churchill's government had staked its entire existence on the principle of resisting Nazi tyranny, not carving up the world with it. Hess seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why this was not an attractive offer. He could not understand that Britain was fighting for its survival and for the liberation of Europe, not just for the preservation of its empire. His behavior during these interrogations only deepened the mystery. He was paranoid, convinced his food was being poisoned, and would swap his plate with his British hosts. He was obsessed with his health, carrying a bizarre collection of homeopathic remedies. He spoke of Hitler with a mystical, religious fervor, referring to him as a godlike figure whose visions were destined to shape the world. He desperately tried to convince his captors that he was speaking for a powerful peace party in Britain, a group of aristocrats, led by the Duke of Hamilton, who he believed were ready to overthrow Churchill and make peace with Germany. This was his most fatal miscalculation, a fantasy constructed from wishful thinking and a profound misunderstanding of British politics. The so-called peace party was a tiny, powerless fringe. The British government listened, recorded everything, and gave him nothing. They saw no value in his offer, only in his intelligence potential. The man who believed he held the keys to peace was simply a prisoner, a deluded envoy from an enemy they were determined to destroy. His grand proposal, delivered with such earnest conviction, evaporated in the cold, pragmatic air of British resolve. The simplest explanation is often the most seductive. In the case of Rudolf Hess, The simplest explanation was handed to the world on a platter by the Nazi propaganda machine itself. The man was mad. This was the first official story, decreed by Hitler in a fit of rage and promulgated by Goebbels with chilling efficiency. It was an act of political damage control designed to cauterize a wound of catastrophic embarrassment. And yet, for all its convenience, the theory of madness has persisted, bolstered by a mountain of compelling and often bizarre evidence. Proponents of this theory argue that Hess's flight was not a political act, but a pathological one, an act of sublime lunacy from a mind that had long ago detached from reality. The evidence begins not with the flight itself, but with the man's life in the years leading up to it. Hess was, by many accounts, a deeply strange individual, even by the Baroque standards of the Third Reich's inner circle. His life was governed by a cocktail of hypochondria, mysticism, and fringe science. He was a fanatical believer in biodynamic farming, insisting on food grown according to specific cosmic rhythms. His pockets were filled with an array of homeopathic pills and herbal remedies, which he consumed for a litany of imagined ailments. Most famously, he was a devotee of astrology and the occult. He surrounded himself with a coterie of mystics, magnetopaths, and soothsayers, whose advice he valued as highly as that of any military or political expert. Key decisions were often postponed, pending a favorable astrological alignment. For Hess, the court astrologer's chart held more sway than a general's map. This was a man who lived in a private universe, governed by its own strange laws. His deteriorating political situation provided the psychological tinder for this fire of instability. As the Führer's shadow, he was fading. The levers of real power were now in the hands of more ruthless and practical men: Bormann, Himmler, Göring. Hess, the keeper of ideological purity, was becoming irrelevant. For a man whose entire identity was based on his messianic devotion to Hitler, this marginalization was a form of spiritual death. The flight, in this context, can be seen as a desperate, grandiose gesture, the ultimate romantic act to regain the Führer's attention, to prove that he, and he alone, still possessed the vision and courage of the old fighters. His behavior after his capture seemed to confirm the diagnosis. His paranoia was extreme. He was convinced the British were trying to poison him, hypnotize him, or control his mind with hidden machines. He would pace his cell for hours, muttering to himself. Then came his most theatrical performance, his appearance at the Nuremberg trials. He claimed to be suffering from a profound and convenient amnesia, unable to recognize even his oldest colleagues like Hermann Göring. He would sit in the dock, a vacant look on his face, seemingly lost in his own world, only to have his memory miraculously return in a dramatic, self-serving speech near the end of the trial. The Allied psychiatrists who examined him diagnosed him with psychoneurosis, with hysterical and paranoid features. They saw a man prone to delusions of grandeur, a man whose grip on reality was, at best, tenuous. And so, the picture of the madman seems complete. A marginalized, eccentric, true believer, steeped in occultism and suffering from paranoid delusions, who undertakes a suicidal mission based on a fantastical misunderstanding of the world, all in a desperate bid to reclaim his place at his master's side. It is a neat, tidy explanation, perhaps too neat. For the central, nagging contradiction remains. If he was so profoundly mad, how did he possess the clarity, skill, and discipline to navigate a complex aircraft for 5 hours across a hostile sea, arriving almost exactly at his intended destination? The madman, it seems, was also a brilliant pilot, and in that contradiction, the door opens to other, more sinister possibilities. This is the theory that has haunted historians and fueled conspiracy theories for decades. It is a story far more complex and tantalizing than simple madness. In this version of events, Rudolf Hess was not a deluded lone wolf. He was an arrow, fired from the very heart of the Third Reich, a secret and deniable peace envoy sent on a mission with the full, tacit knowledge and approval of Adolf Hitler himself. The logic behind this theory is powerful and rooted in the cold, hard realities of grand strategy. By May of 1941, Hitler was on the cusp of his life's great crusade, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The prospect of fighting a two-front war, with Britain still a threat in the West, while his armies were engaged deep in Russia, was a strategic nightmare. The ideal scenario was to neutralize Britain first. A quick peace treaty, one that would leave the British Empire intact and Germany dominant in Europe, would be the perfect solution. But Churchill was intractable. Official diplomatic channels were useless. How, then, to reach the other Britain, the powerful aristocratic circles that Hitler and Hess mistakenly believed were tired of the war and willing to oust Churchill to save the empire? According to this theory, the Hess mission was the answer. It was a classic back-channel operation. By sending his most loyal and trusted disciple, a man whose devotion was beyond question, Hitler could send a credible signal without any official risk. If Hess succeeded, Hitler could step in and formalize the peace. If he failed, if the British arrested him or refused to deal, Hitler could simply activate the prearranged cover story. He could express his theatrical rage, declare his deputy a madman, and wash his hands of the entire affair. It was a plan with a built-in, perfectly plausible deniability. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but compelling. The level of preparation. Hess's flight was a highly complex undertaking. He required access to a state-of-the-art military aircraft, detailed intelligence maps, and long-range weather forecasts. Is it plausible that the Deputy Führer could have done all this in total secrecy, without the cooperation of high-level figures in the Luftwaffe and the intelligence services, who would never have acted without at least a nod from the highest authority? Hitler's reaction. The famous rage at the Berghof, witnessed by his inner circle, could easily have been a performance for their benefit. Hitler was a master actor, capable of turning his emotions on and off at will. His fury served the crucial purpose of establishing his ignorance of the mission in front of the very men who would later testify to it. The willingness of Hess's staff. Men like Hess's adjutant, Karl-Heinz Pinch, assisted him for months. Pinch later claimed he believed he was taking part in a secret mission of state. Would a loyal officer have so readily assisted in what he thought was an act of treason? Or was he simply following what he believed to be the Führer's secret will? The timing. The flight occurred just 6 weeks before the launch of Operation Barbarossa. It was the last possible moment to attempt to secure the Western Front before committing the bulk of the Wehrmacht to the east. The timing is almost too perfect to be a coincidence. In this light, Hess is transformed. He is no longer a pathetic, deluded madman. He is a tragic, loyal soldier, a man willing to sacrifice his reputation and freedom on a secret mission for his Führer. He flew to Britain not in a fit of insanity, but as a calculated, if desperate, diplomatic gambit. He was the ultimate secret emissary, the bearer of a message so sensitive that it had to be wrapped in a cloak of madness. The mission failed not because it was crazy, but because it was based on a fundamental misreading of the British will to fight, a misreading shared by both Hess and his master. There is a third path through the labyrinth of the Hess affair, a theory that rejects both the simplicity of madness and the grand conspiracy of a secret mission. In this more nuanced view, Rudolf Hess was neither clinically insane nor a direct agent of Hitler's will. He was something more complex and, in some ways, more tragic. A lone idealist, acting on his own initiative, driven by a rational, to him, and deeply held set of beliefs that were catastrophically out of touch with reality. This theory posits that Hess was acting alone, without Hitler's knowledge, but not because he was crazy. He acted because he believed he was serving a higher purpose, a purpose that even the Führer, distracted by the day-to-day running of the war, had lost sight of. Hess saw himself not as betraying Hitler, but as serving his ultimate historical destiny. The foundation of this theory is Hess's profound and unwavering belief in the core tenets of Mein Kampf, the book he himself had helped write. Two ideas from that book were central to his worldview. First, that Britain and Germany were brother Nordic nations, whose natural state was one of friendship and alliance. He saw the war between them as a monstrous, unnatural civil war, a family quarrel that was draining the strength of the white race. Second, he believed that Germany's true destiny and its true enemy lay in the East, in the destruction of Soviet Bolshevism and the acquisition of Lebensraum, living space. As he watched the preparations for Operation Barbarossa accelerate in the spring of 1941, Hess became consumed by a single, terrifying thought. What if the unnatural war with Britain did not end? What if Germany became bogged down in Russia, while the British, supplied by the Americans, launched a new front in the West? He foresaw the nightmare of a two-front war, a scenario that he believed could bleed Germany to death and destroy everything he and his Führer had built. In his mind, he was the only one who truly understood the gravity of the situation. Hitler was surrounded by generals and bureaucrats who thought only of tactics and logistics. Hess believed he alone grasped the grand, historical imperative. He had to stop the family quarrel with Britain. It was his sacred duty. His flight, in this context, was not an act of madness, but a supreme act of faith. Faith in his own convictions, faith in the reasonableness of the British aristocracy, and above all, faith that once he succeeded, a grateful Führer would recognize the genius of his rogue mission. He saw himself as a knight on a holy quest, a modern-day Parsifal seeking the holy grail of a Germanic peace. This theory elegantly explains some of the contradictions of the other two. It accounts for his meticulous planning and superb piloting skills. He was an idealist, not an incompetent. It accounts for his shock and dismay when Hitler disavowed him. He genuinely believed he was acting in the Führer's best interests and expected to be hailed as a hero. It also explains his bizarre combination of rationality and fantasy. His goal was rational, preventing a two-front war, but his method, flying to Scotland to meet a duke he barely knew, was based on a complete and utter fantasy about the nature of British politics. In this version, Hess is neither a lunatic nor a puppet. He is a man intoxicated by his own ideology, a true believer who flew his mission with the clear-eyed, terrifying certainty of a fanatic. He was a man who believed he could reshape the world according to the gospel he had helped to write, a lone idealist whose personal crusade crashed, quite literally, into the unyielding wall of the real world. This is the most shadowy and conspiratorial of all the theories, a narrative that flips the entire story on its head. In this version, Rudolf Hess was not the active agent. He was the pawn. He did not decide to fly to Britain. He was lured there. His flight was not his own initiative, but the spectacular culmination of a masterful and ruthlessly cynical intelligence operation, a honey trap set by the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to ensnare one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. The proponents of this theory argue that British intelligence, desperate for any advantage in the dark days of 1941, was well aware of Hess's Anglophile tendencies, his obsession with finding a negotiated peace, and his belief in a powerful anti-Churchill peace party. They decided to exploit this weakness, to play upon his delusions and reel him in like a fish on a line. The mechanism for this deception, according to the theory, was a series of carefully orchestrated, clandestine communications. Through neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal, British agents, possibly posing as members of this fictitious peace party, are said to have made contact with Hess's circle. They would have sent subtle, deniable signals, feeding his belief that powerful figures in Britain were ready to overthrow Churchill and make a deal. They may have used his known interest in astrology, perhaps feeding him predictions through compromised astrologers that the stars were aligning for a peace mission. The supposed target of this operation was the Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess was so desperate to meet. The theory suggests that the Duke's name was deliberately fed to Hess as the leader of this movement, a credible and enticing target for his mission. The goal was to create a specific, irresistible lure. The objectives of such an operation would have been threefold and immensely valuable. 1. A massive intelligence windfall. To capture the Deputy Führer would be to capture a walking, talking encyclopedia of the Third Reich. He would know everything: the state of German morale, the internal power struggles, economic weaknesses, and, most critically, the military's future plans, including the top-secret preparations for Operation Barbarossa. His capture would be the single greatest intelligence coup of the war. 2. Sowing chaos and distrust. Hess's sudden defection to the enemy would throw the Nazi high command into a state of absolute chaos. It would create a paranoia that would ripple through the entire regime. Who else was a traitor? Who could be trusted? It would force Hitler to publicly disavow his most loyal friend, a humiliating act that would undermine the myth of unified Nazi leadership. 3. A propaganda masterstroke. The propaganda value of having Hitler's deputy choose to fly to Britain would be immeasurable. It would signal to the world, and especially to the still neutral United States, that the Nazi regime was not the monolithic force it appeared to be, but was cracking from within. This theory, while lacking definitive proof, offers an explanation for some of the most puzzling aspects of the affair. It explains the almost magical accuracy of Hess's arrival point. Perhaps he was given more precise coordinates than he let on. It explains his utter shock at his reception and at Hitler's reaction. He was a dupe who had been played from the very beginning. The biggest argument against this theory is the silence. If such a brilliant operation had occurred, why was it never revealed? The answer, proponents suggest, is that the secret was too big and too dirty. Admitting that Britain had lured Hess under false pretenses might have had unforeseen diplomatic consequences. More importantly, the secret of what Hess might have revealed about Barbarossa and what Britain did or did not do with that information was a secret so sensitive, involving the Soviet Union, that it had to be buried forever. In this dark, cinematic version of events, Hess was not a madman or a peacemaker. He was simply the prize, the victim of a brilliant and brutal game of shadows. The flight of Rudolf Hess lasted 5 hours, but his imprisonment would last a lifetime. His story after landing in Scotland is, in many ways, even more mysterious than the flight itself. He was transformed from a historical actor into a historical artifact, a living fossil from a buried era, a man held under lock and key for so long that his continued existence became a puzzle in itself. And the solution to that puzzle, many believe, is simple. Rudolf Hess was a man who knew too much. His public re-emergence at the Nuremberg trials was a piece of bizarre theater. While men like Goering postured and fought, Hess presented the image of a broken, vacant shell. He feigned amnesia, staring blankly at his former comrades, claiming not to remember the most basic facts of his life. It was a performance that convinced few, and the court sentenced him to life imprisonment for crimes against peace. He was then sent to Spandau Prison in Berlin, a grim, red-brick fortress that would become his entire world. Spandau was a unique institution, a microcosm of the post-war world, jointly administered by the 4 victorious Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. For 20 years, Hess shared its walls with other high-ranking Nazis. But one by one, They were released or died, until, in 1966, Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach walked free, leaving only one inmate behind. From that day forward, prisoner number 7, Rudolf Hess, was the sole occupant of a prison designed for 600. The absurdity was staggering. A massive fortress, guarded in monthly rotations by 4 of the world's superpowers, was maintained at enormous expense for a single, aging man. He became a ghost haunting the Cold War, a living symbol whose symbolic value seemed to far outweigh his physical threat. As the years turned into decades, a consensus grew among the 3 Western powers. Hess was now a frail, elderly man, a pathetic relic. His continued imprisonment seemed cruel and pointless. On humanitarian grounds, Britain, France, and the United States repeatedly moved to release him. And every single time, one nation implacably used its veto to block his freedom: the Soviet Union. Why? Why were the Soviets so adamant that this one old man should die in prison? The official Soviet line was one of principle. Hess represented the very soul of Nazism, and as a tribute to the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in the war, he must serve every last day of his sentence. But a darker, more compelling theory suggests the motive was not principle, but fear. The Soviets were terrified of what Hess might say if he were ever free to speak. What secrets did he carry from that brief, fateful window in 1941, secrets so dangerous that they had to be buried with him? The explosive core of this theory is the timing of his flight, just weeks before Operation Barbarossa. Did Hess carry a peace proposal from Hitler, a proposal to unite against the USSR? If true, it would prove the Soviets' long-held propaganda claim that the Western capitalists were always willing to ally with the fascists against them. Or, even more damning, does his story connect to the British trap theory? If British intelligence had indeed lured Hess to Scotland, it means they had an open channel to the Nazi high command. What did they learn through that channel? Did Hess, in his initial interrogations, give them a clear and unambiguous warning of the imminent invasion of Russia? And if he did the British government under Churchill deliberately give Stalin only a vague, partial warning, hoping to see the 2 totalitarian giants bleed each other white? If this were true, Hess was a living time bomb. His testimony could have rewritten the history of the Grand Alliance, exposing a level of cynical realpolitik that would have been catastrophic for Anglo-Soviet relations. For the Soviets, keeping Hess locked away was not about punishing a Nazi, it was about protecting a crucial historical narrative. His silence was paramount. His cell in Spandau was not a prison, it was a vault. And he was the secret inside. A man whose knowledge was too dangerous to ever see the light of day. He was no longer a prisoner of war, but a prisoner of memory. The long twilight of prisoner number 7 finally gave way to eternal night on August 17, 1987. In a small summer house in the garden of Spandau Prison, Rudolf Hess, aged 93, was found dead, an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. The official verdict, delivered swiftly by the British authorities then in charge of the prison, was suicide. After 46 years of captivity, the loneliest man in the world had, it seemed, finally given in to despair. A short note to his family was produced, a final, weary farewell. The book was closed, but for a man whose life was a series of question marks, it was perhaps inevitable that his death would become the final, indelible one. Almost immediately, a final dark blossom of conspiracy bloomed over his grave. His family, his lawyer, and a chorus of independent researchers cried foul. They pointed to the sheer physical improbability of the official story. How could a frail 93-year-old man, crippled with arthritis in his hands, barely able to lift a teacup to his lips, have possessed the strength and dexterity to tie a cord to a window latch and strangle himself? An autopsy performed at his family's request noted unexplained marks on his body. The suicide note itself was suspicious, discovered not on his person but later, tucked away in his pocket. A new, chilling theory emerged. Hess had not killed himself. He had been silenced. The motive, according to this theory, was tied to the changing political winds of the 1980s. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost was thawing the ice of the Cold War. It was widely believed that the Soviets were finally about to drop their long-standing veto and consent to Hess's release. After 46 years, the man who knew too much was about to be set free. For certain powerful hidden interests, perhaps within the British intelligence community, the last keepers of the war's darkest secrets, this was an intolerable risk. A free Rudolf Hess, able to speak his mind to a world hungry for his story, was a historical time bomb. He was the last living link to the peace feelers of 1941, the last witness to what Britain knew about Barbarossa and when they knew it. He had to be silenced before he could talk. His death was not a suicide. It was an assassination, the final, brutal act of a cover-up that had spanned nearly half a century. What happened next only deepened the suspicion. Immediately following Hess's death, Spandau Prison, the grim stage for his long confinement, was completely and utterly demolished. The fortress that had stood for a century was systematically torn down, its bricks ground into dust and scattered, its foundations dug up. Every trace of the place was erased from the map. It was a stunningly swift and thorough act of historical sanitation, as if the powers that be wanted to ensure that the very stones could never speak. And so, the enigma of Rudolf Hess remains eternal. Was he a madman whose delusions led him on a bizarre flight of fancy, a secret emissary on a mission from his Führer, a lone idealist on a tragic quest for peace, or the victim of a brilliant intelligence trap? Was his death a final act of despair, or the final silencing move in a game of shadows? The truth is buried, perhaps in the sealed archives of London and Moscow, or perhaps it was never written down at all. It died with the men who orchestrated the war. Rudolf Hess, the man who fell from the sky, remains history's black box, a permanent question mark hanging over the most monumental conflict of all time, his secrets taken, at last, to a grave as silent and mysterious as his life. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.